Welcome to the webinar, everyone. We're just going to wait a minute just for everyone to get online and then we'll get started. Right, I think we'll get going. So welcome everyone to this second webinar in ClimateCare's webinar series on net zero. And today we're focusing on nature-based solutions. Some housekeeping first up. So first thing to notice that you'll all be on mute throughout the duration of the webinar. You can, however, ask questions if you use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll put those to Rachel, our guest and expert, at the end of the webinar. We'll be speaking for about half an hour. We've got 20 minutes focus on us presenting and then 10 minutes of questions at the end. The final thing to notify you of is that this webinar is being recorded and will be distributed to all of the people who have signed up after we're done with the recording. Great, so as I said, the focus today is on nature-based solutions, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Rachel Nutter, who's our Director of Nature-Based Solutions. Rachel, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi there, good afternoon everybody. So I've been working in nature-based solutions, project development for coming up to 3 years now. Before that I was spent quite a few years in solar project development, and I've been in the low carbon technology space for many years of my career. Looking forward to talking this afternoon.
Thanks very much, Rachel. So just moving on to the next slide, what we wanted to do before we dive into nature-based solutions was just to talk a bit about the context, and particularly the corporate context around achieving net zero. First up on the need for action, and I won't dwell on this because I think that most people on the call are probably convinced of the need to tackle climate change, but a quick reminder that at the moment, if emissions remain unabated, we're on a trajectory for 3.5 degrees of warming by the end of the century, which will lead to climate breakdown. In order to tackle that, we need to achieve net zero by mid-century at the latest. And just working backwards from that, we know that to have a good chance of reaching that net zero target, we need to have halved emissions by 2030. So that's reducing the equivalent emissions of the United States, the European Union, and China by 2030, which is, that is the challenge of our time. If you go on to the next slide, please, Matt. What we want to say is just that, we're really enthused by how corporate organizations and organizations across the piece are really rising up to the net zero challenge. And what's emerged is best practice pathway to net zero, which we've set out on this graph here. So what you can see is on the y-axis, you can see tons of carbon emissions. Then on the x-axis, you can see time. And so represented in the red is a corporate entity's footprint. And as you can see, it reduces over time as you work towards net zero year on year. And the key thing about that is that you have to reduce your emissions as a corporate entity in line with what science tells us is necessary to reach global net zero. So it's no good just reducing them, you've got to reduce them in line with a science-based target. In the blue, underneath the dividing line is a corporate's offset activity. And there are a few things to note about that. The first thing you'll notice is that it reflects your emissions year on year. So what that means is that from now on, you'll be carbon neutral or net zero from this point onwards. So you'll compensate for all of your emissions from this point onwards. The second thing to note is that you can see that over time, the kind of activities you're supporting through your offset portfolio will change, and they'll go from what we call avoidance projects. So these are projects which reduce carbon emissions, so they prevent more carbon dioxide from building up in the atmosphere, to what we call removal projects. And so these are projects which take carbon which is already in the atmosphere and sequester it in trees or soil or rocks. And so that really puts an interesting lens on your offset activity, because not only do you need to achieve carbon neutrality this year and next year, you've also got to think long term about securing your net zero position. So that's what we're seeing emerging as best practice. I think that really sets the scene well to introduce Rachel and talk about the critical role that nature-based solutions will play in that offset part of that corporate best practice. So I'm going to hand over to Rachel now, who's going to talk a little bit about, I think the first area is around nature-based solutions, what they are and what they encompass.
Want to move on to the next slide, Matt? Great. So yeah, let's start with a simple question of what are nature-based solutions. So this is any activity that's designed to protect or restore the natural world and address climate change. And you can see there are numerous ecosystems in which that can happen. And then you've got a range of interventions, as Ollie pointed out, from avoiding emissions that would otherwise have happened, so avoidance credits, through to improving the way that we manage forests and land, all the way through to new planting and removing carbon dioxide, so so-called removals credits. A very huge range of activities that could be carried out in those ecosystems. So, for example, on the left-hand side there, avoiding deforestation is obviously a very big lever that we can pull. We've got the Gola project in Sierra Leone that ClimateCare supported for many years. It's a really special forest ecosystem, and that's been threatened by smallholder farming / and burn agriculture. And so there you're working with local communities to implement more sustainable farming practices and do things like scaling cocoa production more effectively. And then at the reforestation, afforestation end of the scale, examples are, we're working on a couple of Asian projects. So one around sustainable bamboo planting, so working with very poor indigenous communities, and then agroforestry, mangrove planting in another country where you've got communities benefiting from being able to sell produce and finding alternative livelihoods, and then mangroves obviously helping to improve some of the coastal resilience there. So quite a range of activities and often very heavily centered around the communities that live in and depend on those ecosystems.
Can you move on to the next slide, please, Matt?
Yeah, so then just quickly on the, what's the potential here, just to kind of get a scale and size around this. So nature-based solutions could make up to almost 40% of the carbon dioxide emissions that we need to deliver by 2030 if we're going to keep below 2 degrees C warming. And the thing I find striking about this is the cost of doing that. So actually, half of that could be done at less than $100 per tonne, which seems like a lot today, but I think in 10 years' time might not seem like such a lot. But even more importantly, a third of that reduction could happen at less than $10 a tonne. So it's eminently affordable. The other thing about nature-based solutions, of course, is it's not just about the carbon. It's these very significant positive impacts on biodiversity, on the environment. So around rainfall, for example, or avoiding soil erosion and all the numerous environmental benefits, but also the impact on the people and the communities that live in and around that land. And we can do the avoidance piece and the removal with nature-based solutions, and more about those to come.
Thanks, Rachel. I think that's a really good introduction and a good reminder of the potential of nature-based solutions to not only tackle climate change, but also to tackle the biodiversity challenge, which is kind of the same side of the other side of the coin. Matt, if you go on to the next slide, please. So in this section, what we thought it would be good to do would just be to answer some common questions that we get from our partners at ClimateCare and put those to Rachel as our Director of Nature-Based Solutions. So if you go on to the next slide, please, Matt. The first question is really, we know that at the point of net zero, in order to achieve net zero, you'll need to balance your residual emissions with removals. So you need to balance your emissions with projects that take carbon out of the atmosphere and sequester it away. What this is leading to is a lot of uncertainty in the short term about whether, with partners asking us, should I be just supporting removals now, which leads to this first question, which is, should I support avoidance or removals projects?
Yeah, and the answer, and I'm warn you now, spoiler alert, I'm going to be using the words both and all and everything quite a lot this afternoon, but yeah, we need to do both, not surprisingly. Avoided emissions are a very significant proportion, the emissions from agriculture and land use, and particularly deforestation, are a really significant proportion of greenhouse gas emissions, and it's a huge carbon sink. So we have to avoid those emissions. We have to do that as a planet. Now, from a practical perspective for clients, that's an opportunity prior to your net zero time, so your carbon neutral period. You can create carbon credits sooner, and typically at a lower cost than you can do for removals projects. So practically speaking, that's a no-brainer intervention. Removals are important. Obviously, reforestation, afforestation presents the greatest potential mitigation in terms of tons of all the NBS approaches. You couldn't do it again. It's all everything and all together. You can't just pick and choose. But that is it's a very significant portion of our ability to sequester carbon. And you need it for clients. You need that for net zero. It's typically a higher investment, it takes longer, and a higher cost of carbon. And so what we tend to see is clients doing a mix of both of those, and that's certainly what we would recommend. There is no point in cutting down lots of trees and then on one hand and then doing lots of planting on the other hand. So for the planet it makes sense, and for clients it makes sense to balance out that timing and cost of credit delivery as you go through that journey.
Definitely. Thanks, Rachel. I think there's a quote by the Science Based Target Initiative, which I think captures it really well, where they say that this decade is the decade of readiness for removals and the decade of action for reductions. And I think that really relates strongly to what corporate offset portfolios are going to look like this decade. There'll be a mix of both things as we scale up to deliver a lot of removals in 2030, but in the short term, really focus on driving emissions down through avoidance projects. If you go on to the next slide, please, Matt. So this again relates to that first question, but specifically for removals, what types of removal projects are there in nature-based solutions and more widely?
So there are mechanical and geoengineering and all sorts of solutions that are in development, as well as nature-based solutions. So you've got things like direct air capture, carbon capture and storage, enhanced weathering, all sorts of things that I'm sure people have come across. Again, we need it all. The magnitude of the challenge is such that I desperately hope that all of those things become economically viable and scalable, because we're going to need them. There isn't a silver bullet. There's no one thing that, gosh, if that came to fruition, it would solve all our problems. It's just simply not that straightforward, unfortunately. And they've all got different advantages. Not one is better than the other. They've all got their time and their place and their advantages. So, for example, if you've locked carbon dioxide into or under a rock, that's a pretty permanent sequestration. The flip side is, you look at something like nature-based solutions. It's available today. It's affordable. It can deliver a very significant proportion of the removals that we need, even when you take into account our need for land, for living and food and fibre and so on. Nature-based solutions give all of the other benefits that we've talked about, and so essentially, everything's got its place. But nature-based solutions, kind of now's the time to get on with that, because it takes time to grow trees and sequester carbon, and kind of the challenge really is how do we get that scaled as quickly as possible.
Definitely. Yeah, and we talk about carbon markets and closing the time gap. So tackling climate change is a really time critical challenge. And we know that nature-based solutions right now offer us this route to scale that isn't going to be so immediate with mechanical removals. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't invest in mechanical removals, but we know that right now nature-based solutions can offer us significant climate change tackling potential. If you go on to the next slide, please, Matt. So this next question is, lots of organizations now are looking at their how they'll reduce their direct emissions, and then they know they'll have their residual emissions in their net zero year, and they'll need to balance those with removals. So the big question is, how do I get removals at scale to balance that, which can often be quite a sizable proportion of residual emissions left in your net zero year?
Yeah, and this is a real sort of rubber hits the road question, and you know, the kind of numbers that people are talking about, clients are talking about, you know, they are significant in the context of removals projects. You know, historically, projects in removals have been smaller than avoidance projects because it takes more time, it costs more, it needs more investment, and you know, there's been a real shift now in people, you know, thinking actually we do need to do removals. You know, we're going to have to, you know, start investing to get those removals now. So I think you know, the limiting factor in general for these projects has been the financing and the demand. So as it has with avoidance projects and things like avoided deforestation projects, when the demand's there, they will scale up. But you know, you can't switch it on. It's not opening a tap. You know, there's a time to get organized, to sort out land rights, to plant, to grow. So you know, there is a lead time on it. And in terms of getting to scale, you know, conceptually, I find it helpful to think about 3 buckets, if you like, of the ways that you could approach this. And you know, on the one hand, on the left-hand side there, you've got large-scale planting. You know, here we're talking about how do you get to hundreds of thousands of tons per annum? So this is large scale. That could be plantations where you've got you know, commercial trees that you're taking timber, you've got timber revenues, or bamboo harvesting, you've got revenues coming from something else that help to support a more affordable carbon price. And that could be mixed with native trees and in there, and agroforestry in the mix as well, you know, and that blend, different blends are possible and different designs are possible. It just changes the cost, the contribution that you need from carbon to make that happen. And I must admit, you know, sometimes people, you know, have reservations around this kind of large scale planting, but I think the moment I completely changed the way I thought about this was when I learned a bit more about how much of industrial timber comes from plantations, and it's a little bit more than 20%. So the rest of it is coming from primary, you know, from primary forest. And timber consumption is increasing, and it's increasing more rapidly than plantation growth is increasing at the moment. And when you get into non-industrial timber, non-industrial wood, it's a very small percentage. So, you know, the world needs timber and building materials. The other place where you get large-scale planting is, you know, for example, on slope stabilization, preventing erosion, stopping desert encroachment, and a great example of that is the Great Green Wall Initiative in sub-Saharan Africa. So, you know, there are other reasons, and there's a lot of that happens in China as well. So, you know, there are other reasons why you might want to do large-scale planting. And again, it's all about what's the value of the other environmental attributes or the other products that are being brought, that, you know, you've got blended financing, people prepared to pay for different attributes. Then you move to the middle bucket, which you know, there you're in the sort of tens of thousands, maybe you start hitting the 100,000 sort of tons per annum type scale. But this is more, we'd say, the charismatic projects, but, you know, these are scalable, there are established models. This is around things like mangroves, woodlots. So for example, in Africa, where, you know, smallholder farmers would be encouraged to grow timber instead of cutting down primary forest for charcoal use. Agroforestry is a good model here. And these are, you know, they can scale. It's all about establishing land and carbon rights. It's engaging landowners, multiple communities. So that just takes time, but it can be scaled, and there are models that work. And that's what a lot of the projects have been up till now. And, you know, amazing sustainable development goal benefits as well. And then the last bucket is the innovation side of things. So things like salt marsh, sea kelp, soil is, you know, that's really is a game-changing pathway. And, you know, there is a lot of work being done on how we measure and monitor, and methodologies developed around soil. But with these sorts of pathways, you know, this is more about really understanding the science, developing the methodologies for this under which you could certify, verify credits, how to measure, how to monitor, how to be robust in the science and the way that we calculate carbon savings and so on. So these are all things that have the potential to really scale in future. They're going to take some time to get there.
So
and what
Rachel,
we tend to find is, yes, sorry, go ahead, Ollie.
I was going to say, just so when you're looking at projects that you could develop today and their relative scales in these different buckets, just to give people listening an idea, what kind of scales are we looking at?
Large scale, you know, then you could be into the sort of hundreds of thousands of tons, you know, potentially over time. In the middle bucket, you're typically in the tens of thousands of tons per annum, and there's a profile over time. It's not it's not the same every single year, but on an average. And then the third bucket, to be confirmed. There's more to be learned about that. But some of the soil projects can get to a reasonable scale. And we tend to see, you know, we generally end up discussing with clients, as you know, a sort of a mixture of those. You know, people tend to want a little bit of a blend because it's about, you know, finding the right volumes, finding the right timing, finding the right cost, and finding the right SDG impacts. And you know, a portfolio often works.
Absolutely. I'm aware that we promised everyone 20 minutes and we're at 21 minutes, so we'll go quickly on to the next questions. So this question was whether there's a lot of focus at the moment on developing new projects, but what are considerations in whether it's better to support existing projects that have already started or to develop new ones completely from scratch?
Yeah, I mean, there are some amazing existing projects that still need funding, and you know, you've got certainty, the projects are running, you can make long-term commitments to get access and more stable pricing, great for the communities and the projects. I guess the reason people invest in new projects is you know, sometimes it's about exclusivity or wanting to be able to talk about creating something new. It can also be, you know, take more risk to have a better pricing over the long term. So, you know, that's a commercial choice. But I think in particular where people are looking at new projects, you know, sometimes that is avoidance type projects, but quite commonly also removals projects because of the lead time that's required and not wanting to wait for 10 years time to find out that either there aren't any credits or they're extremely expensive.
Sure. Yeah, and I think if you cast your mind back to that best practice diagram, and you know that each year you've got to deliver your carbon neutrality, and often that will come from existing carbon credits from existing projects, whereas your longer term net zero goal, you work on developing projects towards that. And
I think even with avoidance projects, we're seeing, and I think one of the things that's probably the biggest change I've seen in the last sort of 6 to 12 months has been how far out clients are looking. You know, it used to be if you had a client that looked out 3 years ahead, that was amazing. Whereas now it's 10, 20, 30 years, which is utterly transformative for scaling up projects.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rachel. Have you gone to the next slide, please, Matt? And this, you know, this is a big question, and this is often where lots of our partners are engaging with ClimateCare and talking to us as experts. What are the challenges that you see with nature-based solutions?
Yeah, I think the main thing is it's not a commodity, and there is no cookie cutter approach, and hopefully that's come through some of the discussion you know, that we've had. It's a ton of carbon, and it's verified, and it's independently verified, and so you can have confidence in the ton, but it's very different activities and lots of very other different impacts that you get around those projects. And I think, you know, it's always worth remembering, you know, you're working with nature, you're working with communities, you're working with governments. You're often in challenging countries or, you know, very low income countries. And you're in a world where, you know, this market is evolving so rapidly, and in the change in, you know, kind of in the last 12 months has been remarkable in terms of policies, carbon markets, standards, and what best practice is. And those are going to continue to evolve. So you've just got a lot of moving parts on all of these, which is, you know, that's what we do for a living. And that's why it's such an amazing sector to be involved in.
Yeah, and on to the next slide, which is around risks. If you just go on to the next slide, please, Matt. Yeah, and so, you know, this is how those challenges manifest. How do I minimize those risks?
Yeah, and clients are really, you know, they're always worried about two things: reputational risk and delivery risk. How am I going to get the credits that I was hoping for? You know, and this is really about, hopefully, you know, we sort of, as I pointed out on the last slide, is, you know, working with a trusted partner who actually understands all of these moving parts, and what does good look like, and what does best practice look like? What does a good project look like? How do I mitigate those risks? I think, you know, around reputational risk, this is really, you know, it's a lot about really doing good due diligence, and on partners, on the projects, on the country, good project design, good governance, you know, looking at the standards that you use. So for example, you know, we're looking at a fairly new standard, FD Vista, and applying that to a project at the moment, which is more about new methodologies and verification of SDG targets, which is, you know, very important to some clients. On the delivery risk side, you know, again, you know, come back to portfolio approach, geographic mix, etc. Really being able to, knowing how to select the right local implementation partners. There's always someone who's doing, you know, has to be doing the work on the ground in the communities, and so finding the right people, managing them. And then the other one is around commercial structuring and making sure that the kind of the money flows help mitigate the risk and align everyone's incentives. So, you know, there are lots of things that we can do to mitigate those risks.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Rachel. If you go on to the next slide, Matt, I'll just, three things that have stuck out for me during this discussion has first been something that I think everyone knows, but is that, you know, nature, what we call nature-based solutions, but fundamentally nature is just going to play this, and does play a critical role in a healthy, stable climate system. But not only that, it goes beyond that in tackling problems like biodiversity, for example. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that, and particularly regarding nature-based solutions, we need avoidance projects and we need removals projects, because we need to protect the natural world that we have at the moment, and we also need to enhance it by growing trees and creating new ecosystems. And the third thing is really, Rachel, you said it recently, but what's really changed now is the long-term lens which organizations are looking at this with. And I think, again, that reflects the demands of nature-based solutions, where it's not a tap that you can turn on and turn off. You need to think about planting trees now, and they'll grow over the next 20, 30 years. And I think that's why we're seeing corporates make commitments to developing projects over that length of time, and thinking on that kind of time horizon, in line with the climate challenge and the net zero trajectory that we're all on. So that's the end of us presenting, and we will now move on to questions. I must confess, and I don't know if Matt, who's on the line, can help. I can't see any questions coming through, so do send them through if you do have them, or Matt, do chip in if you can see them, and that's a technical glitch for me. But Rachel, my first question for you.
Oh, I can see one on the chat on the right hand side, actually, not in the Q&A box, but in the chat box there is a question in there.
Excellent. We will come to that, and please do send your questions in. I mean, Rachel, my first question for you was, with, you know, you expressed it when you were talking, with these more kind of plantation or tree planting at scale type projects, how do you distinguish which ones are good ones and which ones we feel a bit kind of queasy about and wouldn't necessarily support, in the greater context that we need these type of projects as a climate solution?
Yeah, I think there was some recent work done by the Botanic Gardens conservation group, including people like Kew Gardens, you know, very much focused on the right tree in the right place. You know, I think that's just a really simple, it is a really nice summary of it. It's, you know, thinking about, you know, what's the impact of that planting on, for example, water, on biodiversity, on flora and fauna. So, you know, there's some things you can do in the due diligence and the design. It's thinking about, you know, what's the alternative uses of the land? What was here before? You know, what's the right mix of species? So, you know, making sure you've got resilience for pests, for example, from climate change, and pests as a result of climate change. So it's about, you know, local knowledge, specialist knowledge, and making sure you've got enough diversity. And I think the other one is thinking about, you know, as we talked about before, you know, what's the right mix of just doing, you know, you can do all eucalyptus, but actually you can have smaller areas, you can break it up, you can have areas that you leave, there's a comment, and you can just slide the scale on how much that costs you. But yeah, it's finding that right balance, and that's the purpose of carbon finance, is to be able to do those. You can afford to do those things that are a little bit different.
Definitely, thanks, Rachel. We've got some questions coming in now. One you'll be very familiar with is around additionality and permanence, which are two kind of key concepts to carbon markets, but they're particularly pertinent for nature-based solutions. So what are your comments on how we ensure additionality and permanence in kind of projects that we work with?
Yeah, and it's all about the standards, and we only work to the standards that sort of the highest voluntary carbon market standards that are supported and approved by ICROA, the international organisation, and that contains the standards require you to go through a very systematic risk-based approach to making sure to looking at what the fundamental drivers are and the risks to permanence and how you can demonstrate a case. There is buffer allowances on a risk-based basis, so that if there is a catastrophe, that there's a sort of insurance pot for the industry. So there are some very sensible measures in place there. And in terms of additionality, it's all about looking at what are the alternative uses of that land, how the effect that carbon has in overcoming the barriers to that project happening. So it's it's kind of a tried and tested path. The standards continue to evolve, they continue to improve, but there are some good approaches in there.
Yeah. Thanks, Rachel. I think another kind of theme in questions I think I can see is around to what extent we see the kind of projects we're supporting, to what extent should we be supporting mitigation versus adaptation?
Yeah, I mean, as ever, I think we have to do all of this. I mean, it's very easy to be, and I think with all of this, you have to have an air of pragmatism. If we wait for everything to be sort of perfect and solved and do things sequentially, it's all going to be too late. And I think we have to work with be somewhat pragmatic and say it's better to get on and do something. And we will. There's no point in thinking, well, this is all going to be perfect. We'll have sorted it all out. We won't need any sort of adaptation. Yes, of course we're going to need adaptation. The climate is changing around us, so there's lots of amazing work going on around crops and tree species and so on that can survive in a changing climate. So the world can't really, I think, afford to do anything else. And there's plenty of money coming in. It's again, this has been a dramatic change in the last 12 months, and I kind of always did look back a little bit to my life in solar. The reason solar power has been so enormously successful, it was seeded originally by government tariffs and support, but the reason we've got so much power, renewable power, is because people can make money out of it. And great, and this wall of money came in, and I kind of see a number of parallels rolling through on the carbon side. So yeah, I mean it's a great time to be doing these activities. We're pioneering stuff.
Definitely, and I do think that is part of the reason why offsetting is particularly applicable to forest conservation, is that these aren't areas which naturally benefit from capital flows in the same way that renewable energy does, for example, and therefore it's not going to be in anyone's kind of their direct activities as an organization necessarily, so won't be focused on in the same way that it can be through offset strategies and through carbon markets and through compliance markets. There's a good question from Ross here, which was just talking about, for nature-based solutions, do we always need to be considering these through the lens of carbon credits, or can we just support them more broadly outside of the kind of carbon credit, carbon market valuation?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I guess for corporates, it gives them something tangible and measurable, but we do have clients who they want to be able to invest in a particular project because it has some resonance with their customers, some resonance with their project, with their products. You know, so we do see that, and then people aren't doing it necessarily for carbon credits. I guess in a lot of companies it makes it more, it's more definable and tangible and so on. And you know, it's auditable, it's verified, it's defensible in terms of making claims. But you know, I think, you know, things like SD Vista are very interesting, where, you know, you start to develop methodologies and be able to make auditable claims about SDG impacts, which, you know, that's a different thing. And so I'm sure there will be, you know, there will be a range of ways that people can do this. At the moment, it's, you know, how it goes. Somebody in a sector says, I'm going to be net zero carbon neutral, whatever it is, and competitors tend to want to follow that. So yeah, and we do see clients doing a little bit of both, to be perfectly honest. Yeah,
and I certainly think a strength of carbon markets and of offsetting is this concept of proportionality, so that you should compensate for emissions equal to your footprint. Whereas with CSR type activities where companies are sponsoring those, your CSR activity doesn't necessarily need to be proportional to your impact. So I think there's definitely room for carbon-based funding of nature and other ways of funding nature, so long as there's proportionality to your impact and to the challenge. A next question from Nathan, who asks, do you expect the demand for offsets to overtake their availability?
Oh, there's a great question. So when I started in this a few years ago now, you know, if you had demand, you were king. Demand was all. And you know, projects would they get by year and didn't have visibility on money coming through from year to year, which is really tough. You know, you're dealing with often quite poor and vulnerable communities, and you know, you're hoping you're going to get money to them each year. Whereas I'd say that balance has shifted quite significantly in the last 6 to 12 months, where you know, projects are, you know, the supply side is getting more constrained, and we're certainly seeing, I think it's a combination of the amount of demand, but also how far ahead people are prepared to look. So, you know, it used to be if you went to you know, if you were talking about offsetting, about committing for, you know, a year or two out, that was really exciting for a project. Whereas now, we have, if you're not talking about 5 years or 10 years, then I'll wait, because there's plenty of people who are. So I think that dynamic is really changing, and we are starting to see projects get sold out, which we've, you know, not seen before, where we're working with existing projects, and you know, obviously prices start to move up in that world, and it'll pull through more supply, but you can't switch it on overnight. So, you know, the lead time on an avoided deforestation project could be anything from, you know, 18 months to 3 years. You know, you've got to engage a lot of people, get things in place, do some capacity building, etc., get activities working. You know, I would think sort of 2 or 3 years. You know, if you're planting trees, then, you know, if you're looking at fast growing species, then you've got to do all of the design work, get the land, set up nurseries, etc., etc. Then you know, but it's probably going to be 5, 6, 7 years before you start getting any carbon credits out of those projects. If you're doing native trees, it's, you know, longer. You're sort of beyond the 7-year period. If you're doing it in the UK or Northern Europe, it's tens of years. You know, it's the 20, 30-year time horizon. So, you know, kind of comes back to why we need to get going today, and that's why we're seeing a lot more people want to develop new projects, because they want to know they've got the supply and they've got more visibility on the cost of that supply.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's what I was going to say on my side of ClimateCare. If you like interfacing with the organisations that fund the projects, is that lots of organisations are looking towards project development now, exactly as you say, they're seeing this trend of constricting availability, which means there isn't going to be a pool of carbon credits that you can dip into when you like. So the answer to that is to develop your own projects so that you can see your costs and you have security of your credit supply over time. I think there are still some great questions that we'd like to answer, but I think we're going to have to call it there because we are out of time. So thank you very much to everyone for listening today, and there'll be a recording made available after this. And a big thank you to Rachel for joining us. Pleasure.
I'm very happy to, if folks have questions to follow up with after the session, very happy to take those by email, of course, and hope everyone found it a worthwhile 40 minutes of your day.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.